So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our filmmakers to the panel. And I want to start things off just by talking to Lisa Birke, the director of The Land of Milk and Honey. So welcome, Lisa, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Christopher. And a huge thank you to yourself as well as the festival team for putting this presentation together, and especially because the film is in the special 360 format for making it happen. I really appreciate it, so thank you.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you so much. One of the things that intrigues me about your piece, The Land of Milk and Honey, I mean, there's many things that intrigue me about it, but one of the things that I find so curious and thought-provoking is the imagery that's in the piece. I really love the way in which there is a lot of food imagery, both food that seems appetizing and then some food that seems less appetizing, as well as a lot of imagery of weather, the changing seasons, and also rain changing to sun and winter changing to summer and so forth. What was the idea behind some of those pieces of symbolism in your film?
I think I'll start talking a little bit about the environment. So initially, in thinking interested in the at the middle and then look in different directions and have multiple performances going around around the viewer at once, because it seemed to me a little bit of a merging of more traditional forms of performance art that are thinking that through. I also then very quickly realized that I could have multiple seasons in the same space at the same time, and then that would make the actual space, the breaking of space and time, visual. I tried initially to have 4 seasons in the same space simultaneously, but it became much too busy, and found that with the stitching together of the pieces of video that were required for that, technically it became really, really difficult and just too visually chaotic. So that was the thinking behind the seasons. I often compress time, space, and location. I also often deal with themes of femininity and breaking tropes of the feminine. And cakes and making cakes and baking is something that we very much associate with being a woman. So I was really interested in using both the lusciousness, the sexiness of those cakes, but then making this activity of like throwing them on the ground, like also for the viewer, very futile, because in the space the viewer can't actually catch the cakes and they kind of all splat on the ground, and which becomes a little bit a disturbance. The whole work is about a type of dystopia that we always imagine, that there are these places that we can exist in our lives that are utopic, but it's an impossibility. There's always these kind of other contrasts or dark sides to all of our experiences. So the work is symbolic of the female reproductive system as well. We often really glorify the beauty of females and how easy and how fertile we are. But in the piece, I really wanted to turn that on its head and show some of the difficulties, loss, and some of the other things that maybe don't get talked about so much of the female body. And I wanted to make the viewer feel like they were actually in a womb-like space, hence the cutting and the sewing of the character that kind of comes in and is a little bit looming over the
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's really interesting to hear just how much the weight of these objects was considered by you as the artist in the construction of this piece, and how each one has not just one meaning, but several layers of meaning. Thank you so much for your answer. Next, I'd like to welcome Zachary Finkelstein, the director of Port Lands, to the Q&A. Welcome, Zachary.
Hi, thank you.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about some of the imagery in your film. Now, I'm a filmmaker that works with miniatures myself, so I was very interested by the transition in your film that happens early on between the miniature and the gigantic, between, if you like, the macro and the micro, because we start off with aerial views of the Toronto harbor, but then we descend into the water to get views of microscopic organisms. What was the idea behind that transition, and are ideas of scale or perspective?
Yeah, definitely. When I was thinking about opening the film, I knew that I wanted to take viewers somewhere unfamiliar. And I thought a nice way to start that maybe was with these overhead views, these aerial photographs of the Portland's area. Because even though it's not a human perspective, it's still kind of familiar to look down from a map kind of point of view. And the scale, when they're making the map, has to do with thinking about that space in an economic way, maybe thinking about the space for development or for industrialization. And then when we go into the water and you're surrounded by these little microorganisms, but they look really big, then you're in this kind of unfamiliar space, but it's very much focused on the ecology of the space and like the biodiversity there. And also like as a barometer of the health for that area, which I was interested in, like what's living in the water tells you about the health of the water.
That's really interesting because the aerial views, you're right, are something that we would associate with a feeling of authority or control. But when we are thrust into the water itself and we see these microscopic organisms blown up to gigantic size, we almost feel overwhelmed by them. So there's a power relationship going on there too that I think is really interesting. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Zachary.
Yeah, thank you.
Penny, I would love to ask you about your film, EXPO FILM. This film is my memory. Penny McCann is joining us in the Q&A. Now, many of your films in the past have been made without any spoken dialogue at all, but EXPO FILM not only uses voice prominently, but your own. What was it like doing that kind of an artistic gesture in this piece, and was it something that you had to get comfortable doing because it's something that is new in your body of work?
Well, I used in my past, my work from, I'd say, 25 years ago and before, my very early work, I did use voiceover, and my own voice, I sung, whatever. But I always had I've always had a very conflicted relationship with voiceover. And I thought for this piece, because it's a memory piece, it made sense to sort of dip my toes back into personal voiceover. And and my sound designer Ed Egan took the voice that the recording that my voiceover recording, and then kept repeating it. I was like, whoa, okay, here I am. So, and then he degraded it and created that wonderful soundtrack. So it's me there speaking a lot. So.
Well, in a way, it seems like the way your voice is used in the film is almost akin to the way in which the film footage of EXPO 67 is used as a material object, there to be stretched and distorted and manipulated. So it must have taken a little bit of, I guess, courage, I suppose, is what I would describe it as, to be able to listen back to your own voice in the process of editing the piece over and over and over again, and to hear it chopped up and processed in these ways. I can only imagine. I don't even like hearing my voice on an answering machine. So I can only imagine what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Penny. I'd love to talk to Mistaya Hemingway, the director of NAИADE, next. Mistaya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi.
Your piece, which is a beautiful dance film, is set in a really interesting location where what the audience sees is you performing a dance on the surface of a reflecting pool of water. And the more you dance, the more ripples and distortions are introduced into the water, which not only create a very beautiful visual effect, but also distort your reflection. Was the theme of reflection important to you in creating this piece?
Yes, in fact, that was the initial idea. I found a sculpture in downtown Montreal hidden in a building, and it was a reflecting pool. I'd never seen one before, and so I brought my co-director down and I said I would like to dance in this sculpture, but it was very hard for us to access. So we said, well, let's make one. So we used the theater and we we flooded like a large section of the theater. And we were able, and for me at that particular time when I was making this piece, the Me Too movement was just starting up, and I was doing a lot of reflecting back in my past about the ways in which the male gaze has helped or has like influenced myself, like in my own development, my own evolution. And I was really going back to some of those memories and trying to throw away the ones I didn't need anymore. Like, it was really causing me a lot of internal reflection. And so when I saw this reflecting pool, I didn't want it to be just like the typical narcissist kind of looking at the reflection. I really wanted to go as far as I wanted to use it as a feedback loop so that I could go way down into myself and then decide what I wanted to keep and what I wanted to shed. And so for me, that piece, what I'm going through, and why I also keep the shot at the end just on my face for so long was that I was using that to kind of, and so for me, that reflection was really essential to that piece.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's the idea that the physical performance, the dance itself, has an effect on the dancer's sense of self or identity is a disturbing concept, but one that's also deeply moving. So thank you so much, Mistaya. Next, I'd love to talk to the directors of The Gleaners and Ritual for Signaled Bodies. I hope I have the title right, including the punctuation. Benjamin Rosenthal and Eric Souther. Benjamin, let's chat with you first. The stuttering movements that we see in your film of all of the digitally rendered figures evoke for me personally, because I'm a big video game person in real life, the movements or the erratic behaviors of a video game or a computer program that is glitching or that is experiencing some kind of a bug or an error. Is the idea of a glitch or a bug important to you and to Eric as well, whom I'll love to hear from next? In the creation of this work, was that a concept that you talked about?
Well, we've talked a lot about the idea of interruptions, right? The idea of the body interrupted or destabilized. But I'm going to actually punt this to Eric because this is really his area of expertise. And I think his point of view on this is far more sophisticated than mine.
Sounds great. Eric, take it away.
Well, Ben mentions interruptions. I think what's useful in a glitch is that it breaks what is normal and allows us to kind of think about bigger systems at play. And COVID is certainly that. But in our piece, these glitches really ask, in a ritualistic context, to travel down into the body and think about the instability, their genderless bodies, and we put them in this space that they're kind of in a states of possession, or we tried different ritualistic metaphors as kind of teasing out this connection with glitch. And to do this too, Ben developed some animations for the body, but then I was actually able to, with oscillators, attach sound to joints of the body. And so they're destabilized, breaking the flow of like normal animations. And so their oscillations have these states of emergence that get us to some kind of animation that we wouldn't have got to otherwise. So.
Wow. That's really interesting. So in other words, the animation and the sound are inextricably linked in your piece. And I was also really drawn to the idea that you just mentioned about how when things behave or function in quotation marks normally, it doesn't really cause or provoke the audience to question the status quo. But as soon as something starts behaving in the wrong way, we start interrogating what it means. Thank you so much. That's a really interesting answer.
Thanks, Christopher.
I'd love to talk again with Lisa Birke, the director of The Land of Milk and Honey. This is a 360-degree video where the audience is in control of what they see, which means, as a filmmaker, that you're letting the audience control things like the framing of shots or the sequence in which they choose to view things. As a filmmaker, did you try and orchestrate at all what the viewer's attention would be directed towards, one thing at a time, or where you wanted them to look? or did you just give up your control to the audience completely?
The way I think I gave up the to the audience, but there are a number of things that I thought about differently in terms of 360, how to have green screening work in 360. And I also worked with one of my students, Ki-Heng Liang, who did the 3D animation, all the dandelions. So there was a lot of those things that we were more concerned with. Where are they disappearing? How can we fit them into the space? But I think what you mainly have to think about is, because nobody's able to see, at least not in this presentation, where you can only look one direction at a time, you really need to think about the timing, because you need to allow for enough space for the viewer to be able to look in the round and discover. So you're less working with this idea of a narrative unfolding, but more creating an environment where there's things to discover. And I quite like the idea that you may miss something, or that maybe a sound triggers, oh, there must be something else happening. So you start looking around. There's other ways of viewing the work as well that some of the audience might be familiar with, where there's the planet view as well, where you can drag out. So there is then this kind of ball, this world that you're seeing. So with 360, it's quite flexible in terms of how it presented. So I'm also really interested in that it can be in a headset, it can be on a computer screen, it can be in the planet view. So it just opens up the possibilities for video for me, which I find quite exciting.
Well, that's really interesting. It's fascinating to hear you talk about the idea that this would be more of a possibility realm than a limitations realm, because I'm sure a lot of filmmakers, myself included, who are very fussy about making sure that everything in the frame is perfectly correct and that everything is edited very carefully, would have maybe a harder time accepting that much controlled chaos. But it's a wonderful balancing act that we talked about that I think is really interesting. Thank you so much. Next, I'd love to talk again with Zachary Finkelstein, the director of Portlands. Now, your film, Zachary, has another important transition at the end, because we spend a large part of the middle of your film looking at organic life, of microscopic sea organisms and aquatic life and things that are tactile and real. And then we transition into a world that seems to be made of digitally rendered elements, a 3D map of Toronto that feels, in a way, kind of cold and, in a way, almost alien. What were you trying to express with that transition?
I think at that point in the film, I wanted to bring the audience into this like kind of future, not fully formed. At the time when I was making the film, Sidewalk Labs, which is like related to Google, was in the process of trying to purchase land in the Portlands to develop it into some kind of tech hub. And I was interested in thinking about, like, again, going back to that idea of how we think about the economic value of land as opposed to the biological value. I found out about this technology called LiDAR, where they flew over and measured points, like elevation points. And then I got some students at Ryerson University to work with me and convert that into a visualization, which is what we see in the film. And I really liked that it's 3D and we can move through it, but it doesn't feel fully formed. And I had a conversation with the sound designer, Mitchell Akiyama, and I felt like he did this really amazing job with his sound design for that part of the film, with these tones that never really resolve. And so there isn't really closure. There's kind of an openness to that part of the film. It's speculative, I guess, a little bit. Yeah.
It has a science fiction aspect to it, absolutely. And I feel like there's something coldly seductive about it, too. There's something visually, aesthetically appealing or alluring about it. There's got sort of the clean look of like corporate advertising, which I think is really interesting in light of the comments you just made about how that land is being redeveloped in terms of its economic potential and what it means from a corporate or a commercial or even a capitalist point of view, as opposed to a life point of view. Really interesting comments. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
I'd love to talk again with Penny McCann, the director of EXPO Film. This film is my memory. The footage that you see at the very beginning of your film, which is found footage, as I understand, footage that you discovered that was shot by somebody else, an anonymous person, of the Expo 67 events in Montreal. It begins by looking very clean and crisp and beautifully transferred and restored on the screen. But as the film goes on and things start to repeat, the image starts to become more and more visually treated. You might even say distorted or degraded. How are some of those visual manipulations achieved?
Well, the Expo film is based on two found films. One Super 8 that I bought off eBay shot by some anonymous American, and then a 16 millimeter film that was given to me by Nicole Blundell, it's a shout out to Nicole, who's in the Local Heroes program. And it was just serendipitous that she gave me this. So I transferred everything over, and I had these films, and I thought, okay, let's go to town with them. So I optically printed them, worked with Cooper, who's another Ottawa filmmaker, and he optically did all the optical printing with me, and so I was able to that creates the close up and the graininess, and so all the visual effects you see are done on film using film techniques. And then because I had, again, in the spirit of having the actual film, I took some bits that I knew I would never use and stuck them in some dirt and decayed the footage. So so that was my first foray into decay, and I want to do more of it because it's kind of fun to see what happens. So so there was so optical printing, decay, and some contact printing as well were the techniques I used in the film.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's really interesting to hear that for all of the precision that's associated with traditional film stock and celluloid film as a medium, that there can still be so much controlled chaos, because of course you probably have no idea exactly how it's going to turn out when you decayed the film deliberately like that.
Yeah, or optically printing. It's difficult to be, I mean, you can be precise. I'm not precise. So I was willing to see, I chose the clips obviously, but was never 100% sure what images exactly where the framing would be, and I was open to that change, to that happy accident.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes filmmaking is all about happy accidents. That's fantastic. So I'd love to talk again with Mistaya Hemingway. You're the director of the film, which is called NAИADE, and it's a very enigmatic title, a very mysterious title. Could you talk a little bit, please, about how you came across that word, that name, what it means, and why you chose it for the film?
And initially the project was called Fruity, and I had been shooting it. We shot over 3 days, just a ton of different kinds of material. I had all different kinds of characters that I was trying out in the water, and I invited different people in. It was really just an improvised experiment. And then I took the footage away, and for a long time tried to figure out what I wanted to do with it. And then I decided really the thing that I was most attached to was all the material that was in the reflection. I wanted as much as possible to make just a film with the reflections, the distortion and reflections. And then I decided that actually it was a new film project. I didn't want to use the same title that I had been attributing to the other material. And my son, he likes to read a lot of fantasy. He's 12. And at one point he said to me, "Mom, what's a naiad?" And I was like, I don't know. And then I looked up the meaning of naiad, and it refers to, in classical Greek mythology, it refers to these female spirits who live in and govern bodies of water, rivers, lakes, streams, any kind of source of water. And that immediately stuck for me. And I thought, that's the name of the film. That's how that really resonated for me. And so that's where the name came from. And And I was really pleased. It's fun when something clicks like that, where, you just know, and you're like, that's it. That's where I'm going. And it helped a little bit also to guide me as I was editing that film as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. That really blows me away because, I had thought about your film in terms of what the symbolism of it might mean in terms of you as an individual, as an artist, as a dancer, as a filmmaker. But this brings a whole mythological dimension into how I read the character that we see on the screen. So that just opened up a whole nother layer for me. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to talk again with Benjamin Rosenthal and Eric Souther, the directors of The GLEANERS. And I have a second question for you here about the use of landscape in your film, because we see these fragmented or abstracted bodies in a landscape, but in the same sense, they're also part of the landscape. They are part of the world that we see. They are embedded into the environment. So what do you feel about the relationship between landscape and the body?
So maybe I'll jump off with this one. I'm so glad that you asked this question, because the title, The GLEANERS, emerges from Jean-Francois Millet's painting, 1857 painting, The GLEANERS, where peasants' bodies are in the fields picking up the sort of detritus of the harvest. And it is really a hybrid of the body and the landscape, and a sort of the other and the landscape sort of embedded within that. And so for us, I think the idea of the landscape as inseparable from the body is deeply connected to a fragmented experience, right, of the body, but also to a very queer experience of these bodies, right? So they're non-normative, and the landscapes they inhabit are non-normative, right? So the sort of world-building possibilities of that are, I think, for us, incredibly important aspects of that. And then also the bodies signal the landscape, but the landscapes also signal to the body and ask of them sort of performative actions or forms of intersection. And maybe Eric has something he wants to add to that. I don't know.
Eric, do you want to jump in?
Well, I guess I think Ben kind of summed up the landscape, but I think what was interesting to us is the systems we were working in all real time. And so Benjamin and I could move and manipulate these things and see them work in the landscape and have cameras kind of rotate around. And I think that kind of allowed us to really capture what those landscapes were doing and how those bodies were existing, but also just kind of freely move those materials around and into juxtaposition with one another to kind of find these serendipitous connections or happy accidents like we've already talked about earlier.
That's really fascinating. It's so interesting to me because in so many works of art, especially in cinema, we see abnormal bodies, in quotation marks, or queer bodies, treated as kind of an interruption or an aberration in a landscape. But here it seems to be a relationship that's much more symbiotic and intertwined, which I think is really interesting and thought-provoking. So thank you so much, Benjamin and Eric. So that's all for me for today, but I'd just like to take an opportunity to thank our wonderful filmmakers for joining us today. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Christopher.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Christopher.
you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.